Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. October 20th, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Fallout of Brian Pillman death. SEVERN injury at Pride debut card. International Wrestling Forum pay-per-view and more. By Observer staff. So this was the week the corpse of Brian Pillman was being used by everyone for their own personal vendettas. At least, that's what everyone was saying about their enemies. Whether it was Eric Bischoff saying how disgusted he was about the WWF and the USA Network using the death and rushing on the Melanie Pillman interview the very next day to draw a rating on October 6th, something that was the prevailing view from virtually everyone within the industry we spoke with as the week went on, to the complaints not only about having teased the interview through most of the show but of the nature of the interview itself, or Jim Cornette claiming Phil Mushnick was using the death to further a personal vendetta against the WWF in his editorial on the October 13th Raw, or the belief that the WWF put Cornette up to doing the promo, which was delivered better than probably any pro wrestling interview all year, to use the corpse of Pillman to cut a promo on Mushnick based out of fear of what someone from the outside looking into the situation would discover, to the tremendous amount of second-guessing in hindsight about how everyone in and out of the business handled the touchy situation. Brian Pillman lived for being the center of controversy. And in death, the situation turned out to be no different. After reflecting back one week, without question the Melanie Pillman interview in hindsight was a bad idea. While I haven't spoken with anyone in the WWF on the subject, I'd be shocked if in hindsight they at this point haven't come to the same conclusion, and there are people who have given me that impression. It was too soon. It shouldn't have been done live. Some questions appear to be asked attempting to garner a close-up of her crying. Given certain realities of the situation, it put Mrs. Pillman, already in an incredibly emotionally trying situation for both obvious and not so obvious reasons, under a microscope that she didn't deserve to be put under. My impression is that the interview stemmed from a conversation that Vince McMahon had with her the previous night, where she spoke about wanting to warn other wrestlers and their families about painkillers and for them to try and avoid a repeat of this situation. McMahon said that he wanted to put her on television to say that, but the point didn't get across as well for a variety of reasons. The fact the interview was teased throughout the show and they showed the photos from his basement did come off as ratings driven. I'd hate to think so but recognize the realities of this business and know that it is a possibility, and it isn't as if the record companies that promote rock and roll stars don't have business plans of making money off deaths, considering that's the one industry where the per capita mortality rate seems to be worse than pro wrestling. In the video that aired after the interview, I was uncomfortable with him claiming that his 1996 car wreck was the result of a drunk driver when it was actually him losing control of the vehicle and running off the road and being thrown from it when it rolled. Personally, I'm willing to cut McMahon and the WWF a lot of slack for how it handled October 6th, if only because if there were numerous errors in judgment in how things were handled, everyone making those decisions was also under a tremendous amount of emotional stress. There was criticism of the promotion not announcing the death to the fans in St. Louis for fear it would dampen the enthusiasm of the live crowd at the pay-per-view. Certainly it put a shadow on the pay-per-view portion of the event. Just as the show was going on the air, the WWF told Elliot Pollock, Pillman's business agent, not to mention USWA Commissioner, that they had decided not to mention the death at all during the show, but then minutes later changed their mind. Mushnick wrote only a few lines during the week, basically pointing out that if this had been another sport, it would have been page 1 news and there would be investigations because of the frequency of deaths of wrestlers, and also called Pillman an admitted steroid user. That line got a lot of people hot. It's a term that isn't incorrect, and there is a very slim chance it's applicable to the situation since the preliminary diagnosis of his death was a heart attack and apparently he had used Decadurabolin somewhat recently as a desperation attempt to strengthen his lower leg, but most of Pillman's steroid use was during his football days and the early part of his wrestling career, which was many years back. The WWF, which was scared to death from the moment it learned about the death about how Mushnick would write about it, apparently had Cornette go on television to attack Mushnick about taking advantage of the death to wage his personal attack against the WWF and his crusade against steroids and pro wrestling. This is a situation where I can see both sides of the story from their respective positions to a point. The idea of abolishing this industry is ludicrous, and I don't agree with how strongly Mushnick comes against the industry, but for the most part can argue that most of the points he makes have validity. And for all of Cornette's protesting about the Bill of Rights, Mushnick has not only the right but his job, and the reasons he's won awards from his job is because he pulls no punches and doesn't go halfway with his opinions, in many ways no different than Cornette. There are legitimate problems with the industry, and the number of deaths is one of the major ones, and many of its stereotypical portrayals of various ethnics and women to children, that Mushnick has pointed out. In the long run, Had it not been for Mushnick, probably more than any other person, and his enemies can deny this until they are blue in the face, but if they do, they are lying to themselves. The steroid situation within pro wrestling today may be just as rampant as it was in 1991, and the number of injuries and even tragedies stemming from it would be greater to go along with it. Not to mention that the style of wrestling in the ring would be totally different. At the same time, his categorization of pro wrestling fans as a group I'm not comfortable with, and Cornette made some valid points in his commentary. The pro wrestling fans Mushnick deals with on the internet validate his belief about most or all wrestling fans, and it's a belief grounded in some cases, but I think it's unfair to paint all of them with the same brush. But a lot of the anti-Mushnick backlash comes from wrestling fans who want to blame the messenger because they are hiding from or aren't able to deal with the message. This latest chapter of the story goes back a few weeks. Mushnick has written a few columns of late, mainly anti-WCW, about wrestling. In one of them, he criticized the management of Madison Square Garden for firing Marv Albert for a sex crime but not canceling WWF shows at Madison Square Garden when it was proven in court that the WWF was built on steroids, or words to that effect, as I don't have the column in front of me, and the fact is a slight semantic difference in the wording could make a big difference in the points either side could make on whether or not the statement was fair. WWF was furious, using the 1994 U.S. government v. McMahon not guilty verdict as saying the exact opposite was true. Cornette made that point in his interview. As far as the decision-making process at Madison Square Garden regarding either Marv Albert or pro wrestling, that's another issue, and I don't think the two things are comparable to begin with. But to use the not guilty verdict, Cornette's saying the McMahon was declared totally innocent of all charges was technically incorrect, as the verdict was not guilty, although that may be nothing but a semantic argument, as a defense when virtually all the testimony in that trial confirmed everything Mushnick had written and that Titan had denied years earlier on the quantity of the steroid use in the company. Hulk Hogan testified to 75-80%, maybe more, of the WWF wrestlers as steroid users. Jim Hellwig testified to 90%. Is a bad can of worms for Titan Sports to try and reopen, let alone to try and defend themselves against Mushnick with. Titan has attempted to use the trial verdict as proof that there was never a steroid problem, but the trial was only about 2 points. Did Vince McMahon distribute steroids to Hulk Hogan, and did Vince McMahon and George Zaharian enter into a legal conspiracy to distribute steroids to the wrestlers? The first issue was thrown out because it was being tried in the incorrect venue, and truthfully, given the evidence at the trial, there is no way there could have been a conviction, and McMahon was declared not guilty on the second point. If the trial was to decide whether the WWF had a steroid problem, or were most of the WWF wrestlers on steroids, or even was the WWF itself built on the back of steroids, based on virtually all the testimony, the result would have been different. Additionally, it was proven in court that the WWF had many top wrestlers on steroids. Dr. George Zaharian III was declared guilty and spent a few years in jail for, among other things, illegally distributing steroids to several WWF wrestlers. The fact is, for the WWF to try and argue about the past and the steroid subject with Mushnick is an argument they have little logic and only a misinterpretation of the end result of a trial and not the testimony of the trial to stand on. It's an old story. The business has changed tremendous since that time. But there were three basic viewpoints that people had within the industry who called here on Monday and Tuesday had on the Cornette interview. One, that Cornette was right in almost everything he said. Another was that it was a great delivery and a fantastic promo, but in the long run would explode in the WWF's face. I believe, in fact no, Cornette was every bit if not more sincere in what he said than in his promo the previous week on Hall and Nash because of his delivery. However, my gut reaction, basically shared by many who called since the promo, was that it was a preemptive strike by the WWF to attempt turn the focus of a potential story that could be negative to the company in regard to the death of Brian Pillman into a personal issue against Mushnick and get the personal vendetta angle out to the public and its fans, to try and rally wrestling fans to their side and make the company the babyface against the heel Mushnick, for fear of what a close examination into the Pillman death could reveal. In hindsight, people who want to point a finger of blame at WWF have a lot of points to draw on. Should he have been put back on the road full-time in his condition? Well, in hindsight, no. But remember that Pillman tried to publicly downplay the level of pain he was in because it was very important to him to earn his keep and not be someone who is under contract and sits around and collects his money with a dubious injury as some have done. Not to mention that even though there were aspects of wrestling that he hated, he did live for other aspects of the business. Should the WWF have tried to put him in rehab? Well, in hindsight, yes. But he probably would have quit the promotion before going. It's easy today to say he should have been a heel manager, or a heel commentator rather than put in a position to wrestle several times per week. Unfortunately, hindsight is 20/20, and some of the people in decision-making positions knew his past history too well, of being someone who athletically had defied the odds, literally from childbirth. While people may not have known all the details, they knew the basic story and wanted to give him another chance to beat the odds again or, as some critics might say, extract their pound of flesh from him. Pillman's life was well documented from newspaper clippings that covered his athletic accomplishments from his youth. He should have died at the age of 2 and again at the age of 4 when his heart stopped both times due to complications from cancer. He played the defensive line in high school as a 5'7", 147-pound junior and regularly blew by the 200-pound offensive lineman. He led the city in tackles and sacks as a senior, yet was the only member of the all-city team to not get even one college offer because the idea of a 5'9", 180-pound defensive lineman in college ball is on the surface ludicrous. When he was a teenager, he was actually even better at ice hockey than he was at football, starting as a 15-year-old on men's teams every Saturday. He walked on and was placed on the 7th team as cannon fodder at Miami of Ohio and told since his attitude was so good that if he played his cards right for 4 years, by the time he was a senior he could get a jersey and make the traveling squad. He wound up as the backup nose guard midway through his freshman year and was actually by all accounts at the time a better player than the starting senior. He probably discovered steroids between his sophomore and junior year, as he went from, according to local newspaper reports, in one summer from a 195-pounder with no muscle definition, although by this point he was already a starter and a good player as a defensive lineman, to a 225-pounder described as having the physique of the Incredible Hulk, and bench pressing 425 pounds and squatting 600, attributed to pawing around with a local contest-winning bodybuilder. During his junior year in 1982, he was a Division I AA first-team All-American middle guard. As a senior, he was the Mid-American Conference Defensive Player of the Year, leading the conference in both sacks and tackles, and the only member of the 1983 AP All-American team to not be drafted by the pros, yet still made the Bengals despite his size. He came back from a shoulder injury suffered early in his wrestling career that was at first considered to be a career ender. I probably know the situation better than all but a few people, and I can't in any good conscience point fingers at the WWF when it comes to blame or culpability in the death, nor did I sense others equally close or closer to the situation coming to a different conclusion. I could also see where an outsider investigating but not truly understanding the situation could come up with a lot of evidence to come to a different conclusion. On October 7th, the WWF's General Counsel sent letters out to several doctors known to both management and the wrestlers as being so-called mark doctors that the boys go to. The basic letter was to reiterate company policy, which has been largely not enforced, banning physicians backstage with the wrestlers except in the case of an emergency. The only physicians allowed backstage under other circumstances would be those assigned by state athletic commissions. Ironically, the most famous mark doctor, the famed Dr. Zaharian, fell under this umbrella, or those sent by the WWF itself to compile medical information needed by the company. The WWF also said that any writing of prescriptions or dispensing of medicine to wrestlers should only be performed through an individual appointment at the physician's office in a traditional doctor/patient relationship. Listing all Pillman's past accomplishments isn't meant to forget that his practical jokes were legendary or to ignore that there was a dark side to him, largely the drugs and wild behavior, that caused good friends to become estranged from him and put his marriage in jeopardy and may have played a role in his death. The stories from college and his early days in Calgary were incredible. Pillman at one time was the hero of Mark Coleman, who was a freshman at Miami of Ohio when Pillman was a senior and the star of the football team, for an incident in the dorms where he had sex with a woman who was hanging upside down from a pull-up bar wearing gravity boots, while the other jocks watched. The joke before people who knew Pillman knew him is that they figured the letters in Penthouse were all a work. But once they knew him, they knew they were real and that Pillman wrote most of them from personal experience. Another time in Calgary, Pillman and Bill Kazmaier, who Pillman nicknamed Quagmire, who at the time was probably not only the strongest man in the world but probably the strongest man who ever lived, who Pillman routinely would torture unmercifully to the amusement of all the other wrestlers on the circuit, were about to get into a fight once the bus was about to stop. By the time Pillman was done telling made-up stories about how he beat up Lawrence Taylor, Mike Webster and Mike Tyson in street fights, and Kazmaier heard and evidently believed them, Kazmaier ran away from Pillman, which was a hilarious sight seeing the world's strongest man running from fight against a guy half his size. As far as the cause itself, the toxicology reports had not been completed at press time, so his death certificate at this point still doesn't list a cause of death. Pillman's funeral took place on October 10th in Walton, Kentucky, a suburb of Cincinnati. There were about 150 people there. Most were family and friends, only a few from the industry, basically limited to Bruce Hart, his original trainer Joey Maggs, the WCW jobber who was like his little brother, Pollock, WCW Executive Vice President Eric Bischoff, former area wrestler Leigh Thatcher, and a few of his students. There were speeches by his high school football coach, who thought someone was playing a rib on him when he first saw 147-pound Pillman as a junior going out for the defensive line, by local radio talk personality Bill Cunningham, who frequently had Pillman as a guest, by Bruce Hart, who was so moved he couldn't continue his speech several times, to his college football roommate who noted that Pillman was a genius as a student in college. He could get a book and within 20 minutes know everything in the book, and related how they both nearly got kicked out of college when he was about to fail a class which would have made him ineligible for football. And Brian, who was a great student, let him copy off him except they ended up getting caught, his best friend from high school and a few others. Vince McMahon and Jim Ross attended a private wake the previous evening limited to family and a few close friends. Dan Severn's attempt at the most ambitious double in the recent history of NHB was curtailed due to injuries suffered in his match with Kimo Leopoldo on October 11 at the Tokyo Dome. The match, a 30-minute draw in which by all accounts had there been judges, Severn would have won the decision easily, ended up with Severn suffering injuries to both his thigh and hand. He suffered calcium deposits in his quadriceps muscle from Kimo's leg kicks, with one thigh reportedly being about 25% larger than the other from the swelling, and suffered soft tissue damage in his hand from the number of punches he threw, even with gloves protecting the hand, to Kimo's head. The hand was even more badly swollen than the thigh. He also suffered a black eye from a kick to the face. After being examined by doctors upon his return from Japan, he was forced to withdraw from his UFC heavyweight title match against Maurice Smith on the October 17 pay-per-view show from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. Semaphore Entertainment Group decided, after considering many options, to go with its original alternate plan, and Tank Abbott, 6-5, will challenge Smith for the title in the main event. Severn, who asked for a rematch with Kimo, but inside an octagon cage with no time limit, expects he'll be able to return to pro wrestling action for his next IWA tour starting on October 25. The doctors who examined him felt he'd be able to do shoot matches within a few weeks, and he's targeting late November or early December for a show likely in Brazil. Officials from Semaphore Entertainment Group that runs UFC were very unhappy with how Severn handled the situation of signing for the Tokyo Dome match against a tough opponent 6 days before their pay-per-view, without consulting them. Severn had been offered a contract in August which specifically stipulated he couldn't do a match between the signing of the contract and the UFC event, but put off signing his UFC contract and then sign the Japan deal and the UFC deal. The general belief is that Severn may not get another shot in UFC, and certainly not another title shot. Smith-Abbott is an intriguing matchup. Abbott is stronger, and should be able to take Smith down. Smith is far more skilled, and in much better condition. Abbott can hit hard, but his knockout power isn't going to last for more than a few minutes if they stay on their feet, since Smith is going, in time, to be able to knot up his thigh with a leg kick switch, combined with the conditioning factor, take the power away from Abbott's punches after a few minutes. Abbott is certainly someone Smith would on paper have an easier match with due to the way the styles match up than Severn, but it is no guarantee, although most would favor Smith, based on how styles match up, that Smith would necessarily beat him. Additionally, in the heavyweight tournament, Stephen Graham withdrew due to blowing out his knee in training, so his place in the first-round massacre at the hands of Mark Kerr will be taken by Gregory Stott. In a match literally stemming from years of hype and in a minor way the lack of which was a small cause of the death of one of the hottest promotions in the world, Rickson Gracie and Nobuhiko Okada finally met in the Tokyo Dome. As expected, given that this was a shooting match, the match and the result were anticlimactic, with Gracie reputed in many circles as being the world's greatest fighter, winning in 4:47 of the first round with a cross-arm breaker submission in what was reported as a totally one-sided match on the first show of the KRS promotion called Pride 1. Despite reports and rumors that the show was going to be a financial bomb, the show drew a very healthy crowd, announced as being 46,863, although reports we've received indicated the crowd at 35,000 to 37,000, with about 5,000 comps. All of the $4,035 and $7,060 tickets, which would be the upper deck seats, were sold out, as were the ringside tickets, priced at 100,000 yen, $850, the highest ticket price in the history of pro wrestling if one would classify it in that category, since it was something of a shoot show. The crowd makeup was described as being 99% pro wrestling fans, mainly there once again to see Takada in a big match just as they had in the past for his stadium matches against the likes of Vader, Keiji Muto, Shinya Hashimoto, and Genichiro Tenryu, and the show drew a heavy walk-up, being on a holiday weekend in Japan filled with major live wrestling events in Tokyo. It was probably the largest crowd in history and certainly the biggest money show in the history of NHB. The fact that Takada lost and basically got no offense in before losing wasn't a surprise to the Kainishenti, but had to come as a major psychological blow to the audience that had seen Takada thrill them before in worked shooting-style situations as the top star of the now-defunct UWFI promotion, a promotion in a very small way that Rickson Gracie began the downward slide of. On December 7, 1994, UWFI wrestler Yoji Anjo along with several Japanese photographers showed up at the dojo of Rickson Gracie in Santa Monica, California to issue an on-the-spot challenge. The idea was that they expected Gracie not to respond, being it was coming out of the blue, and with the name both Gracie and younger brother Royce had developed from being unbeaten in NHB competition, Anjo would make UWFI, a work shooting style pro wrestling group, appear to be real as well. In a worst-case scenario, Anjo had told friends that he figured, weighing about 220, that fighting an 80-kilogram, 176-pound guy, and being the one of the top submission fighter in his dojo, that his weight and experience with submission would enable him to handle the Gracie myth. Anjo and Yuko Miyato, who were handling the booking and making the key decisions for UWFI at the time, already had their follow-up angle set up if Gracie wouldn't fight him. They would send a younger wrestler to train with Gracie for several months and learn the style, then have the younger wrestler challenge the sensei, force a showdown and beat him. Because of Gracie's lack of size, they didn't even think they'd have to send one of their two most talented younger wrestlers at the time, Kiyoshi Tamura or Masahito Kakihara, to accomplish their goal. The end result is that when Anjo showed up at the dojo with Shinji Sasazaki, the UWFI's U.S. representative, causing trouble, Gracie, who was at home with his wife at the time, was given a phone call. Gracie, taping his fists in the car on the way, drove down to the academy, accepted the challenge from the unknown Japanese wrestler who he himself thought was Takada. Before any of this happened, UWFI had been in contact with Gracie to do a cage match with Takada, but once the realities of the pro wrestling business were explained to Gracie, he wanted no part of it. In front of about 20 students in the academy, with the Japanese press kicked out of the dojo so they couldn't shoot the action, Gracie mounted Anjo quickly and proceeded to destroy him for 7 minutes, pummeling his face and body to the point Anjo's face was swollen to unbelievable levels, before making him tap to a choke. Getting destroyed like that and the unsportsmanlike manner in which Anjo tried to set the whole deal up turned him into a major heel in Japan. But for Takada, the top star of UWFI, he remained silent on the subject, disappointing his legion of fans who believed the fabricated image of him as the best fighter in the world and wanted him to step up to the plate and gain revenge for the promotion and challenge Gracie. Some of Takada's manufactured image was created by grandstand challenges such as when Luthez, who worked with UWFI at the time, issued challenges to all world champions to face Takada to prove who the real champion was. As it turned out, UWFI then made a deal with WCW's champion at the time, Vader, and much to the chagrin of WCW, not only did Vader make the big money deal, but while holding the WCW title, he went to Japan for an outdoor stadium match with Takada which drew a sellout of 46,000 fans, and put Takada over clean with the cross arm breaker in a legendary match. When Takada failed to address the Gracie issue and make a challenge, his stock and reputation took a serious blow, and with it, so did the promotion, and it started the downward spiral which resulted in UWFI's popularity taking a nosedive, and having to work and be subservient to New Japan in their angle set up 1 year later, and eventually at the end of 1996 the promotion folded. With Takada recognizing that his career was coming to a close, he made it known earlier this year that he was willing to do the match that would have been an incredible draw 2 or 3 years ago. Of course, Gracie's asking price, which worked out to around $900,000 provided he won and the show drew well, scared a lot of prospective promoters. Takada was expected to receive $180,000 for the match. Due to problems with sponsors pulling out, the match was announced and postponed several times this year to the point where it was generally believed it would be a dream match that would never take place. Even in the weeks leading up to the match, there were rumors that the advance was so poor the show would wind up being a financial disaster and maybe fall apart at the last minute. But it didn't, and like the match with Anjo in the nearly empty dojo, the background of the story takes a lot longer to explain than the match itself. Takada tried to dance around Gracie to get in a punch or a kick. Takada attempted to throw a few knees but was quickly taken down and mounted. Takada held him close, trying to hold on for the end of the 5 minutes round, but Gracie, 39, pummeled him from the mount with rapid punches to the face and body, and then quickly maneuvered him into an armbar and the match was immediately stopped. The finish came as a major blow to the live audience because one of Takada's big spots in UWFI was being caught in that same armbreaker by whomever his foe was, and gutting it out, and either getting to the ropes, which wasn't allowed in this match, or breaking the hold after a lengthy struggle. In this case, since it was real, he only lasted literally a second or two after the hold was put on. Since his heyday, Takada's career has taken a tumble, both from his myth being exposed doing jobs for Muto, Hashimoto, and Tenryu, and his abortive attempt to earn a seat in Japanese parliament where he ended up destroyed in the election. At 35, 2 years after the first time he's talked of retirement, there really doesn't seem to be a lot left for him, which is probably why he agreed to do a match that realistically he had no chance of winning. Takada, who hasn't done a pro wrestling match since December, will return to pro wrestling with the Kingdom promotion on December 14th at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym. At the show was Akira Maeda, Kiyoshi Tamura, and Yoshihisa Yamamoto. After Takada lost, fans began chanting loudly Maeda's name, particularly when both were shown on the large video screen. In 1995, Yamamoto had a legitimate match with Gracie, and lasted more than 20 minutes before losing to a choke. In both of the old UWF promotions, Maeda was the top star and Takada was his understudy. However, even though Maeda is a much larger man than Takada, he's now 38 and has been out of shape for years and living on his reputation, and also will probably retire in a few months and would be looking to cash it in on one big stadium payday. Such a match, if it were to be signed for next summer, would have an even more depressing ending for the Japanese audience. Maeda wouldn't comment to the press after the show about a match with Gracie. From the US perspective, the most important match on the show was between Severn and Kimo. By taking a match so close to his UFC title match, Severn was putting at risk his UFC title shot in the event of an injury. However, his payout for this fight, $40,000, was much larger than UFC was offering, and he felt a win over Kimo on a big show in Japan would mean more to his career long-term, since he felt Japan was long-term where his career would take him, than becoming the first two-time single-match champion in the history of UFC. This was not an entertaining match. There was a long period of stand-up and dancing, and Severn himself said much of the match was a glorified boxing match, with a lot of people surprised at how well Severn did. Other parts of the match were similar to the now legendarily bad Severn vs. Ken Shamrock's second match, and even the normally polite Japanese audience booed heavily. Severn, 16-3-2, was able to mount Kimo, 7-2-1, but didn't do any serious damage to him and Kimo ended up escaping. Kimo was bloodied from Severn's punches, but never in serious trouble until the end, but Kimo did little on offense, with Severn's most severe injury being punching his right hand silly on Kimo's head. All the matches were held inside a ring as opposed to a cage, and Severn said that Kimo, who he called one of the strongest men he'd ever face, held onto the ropes numerous times to avoid both being taken down and being launched. Severn at the finish had Kimo down and was raining down hammer and elbow strikes. The show was the first pay-per-view card ever in Japan, although with the total universe being only 100,000 homes as compared with nearly 30 million in the US and Canada, pay-per-view is at this point not a potential moneymaker. The card itself lasted more than 4 hours. Perhaps the most notable behind the scenes was the re-emergence of Miyato, who along with Anjo was in Takada's corner for his match. Miyato had disappeared more than 2 years ago and never resurfaced when UWFI was revealed to be in its financial predicament. The show was supposed to be an all-shoot show. Because of the presence of pro wrestlers like Takada, Severn and Mitsuharu Kiao, formerly Koji Kiao, there were plenty of suspicions and rumors about all the matches, or at least the matches involving those three being works. We'll reserve judgment on the entire show until viewing the videotape. Based on the reports we have from some very inside sources, there were worked matches on the show that were obvious. Severn Kimo and Gary Goodridge vs. Oleg Toktarov were definitely shoots. Even without seeing the tape, I'd be almost certain given how the match went that Gracie Takada was as well. I was told that Kazunari Murakami vs. John Dixon, Kiao vs. Nathan Jones and Igor Mindert vs. Hiroki Kurosawa were all worked. Akira Shoji vs. Henzo Gracie was said to have looked questionable. However, the question on that is why would Gracie would allow himself to be held to a draw and to look so poorly, since all reports indicate he'd have lost if there was a decision, against a no-name fighter. KRS during the show announced a second show, called Pride 2, will take place on January 18th at the Yokohama Arena. In other results: 1. Murakami beat Dixon in 134 of the first round with the armbar. Murakami was 1-1 in EFC, beating Bart Vale and losing in a title challenge against Maurice Smith. Dixon has done NHB around the world, most recently losing to Severn in Biloxi, Mississippi. After the match, Murakami challenged the Gracies. 2. Goodridge 7-5, knocked out Toktarov 9-4-2 in 4:57 of the first round. Toktarov tried to box with Goodridge, who was more experienced in that game, and paid the price. He was bloodied up, big surprise, and knocked down, but got up. He was then hit with 2 devastating punches and knocked completely out and carried out on a stretcher. The knockout was so brutal, with Oleg collapsing and landing on his face, and he was knocked so cold that there was an immediate fear that he may have been killed, but after going to the hospital for an exam, he recovered and was fine the next morning. Goodridge suffered either a sprained ankle or a broken foot as well. It was said that Goodridge fought almost a perfect fight in avoiding going to the ground and keeping it a boxing match. 3. In a huge surprise, Enzo Gracie was held to a 3-round draw by unheralded Akira Shoji. For whatever reason, one of the 3 rounds lasted 10 minutes and the other 2 lasted 5 minutes, so it was a 20 minutes match. The reports we received is that, shockingly enough, had there been a decision, Shoji, who was the aggressor most of the fight, would have gotten it. 4. Kiao, the War Pro Wrestler, beat Nathan Jones, a 6'10", 350-pound world's strongest man contest type, who went into the match with no fighting experience. Kiao took him down and grabbed an armlock in 2:14. Kiao was crying after the match, which some saw as a sign the match had to have been real, although there were more rumors of suspicion ahead of time regarding this match than any other on the show. 5. Branko Sidicic, the famous K1 fighter and first-ever K1 Grand Prix champion in 1993, went to a no contest with Ralph White, a kickboxer from the U.S., in just a few seconds. Sidicic, 42, either knocked White down, or White slipped and went down. Different sources conflict on that one. Sidicic kicked him when he was down, which was against the rules, and the kick basically knocked the hell out of him to the point the fight had to be stopped. Since it was an illegal move that caused the damage, it was ruled no decision. 6. Igor Mindert, at one time the top-rated super heavyweight amateur in Russia, destroyed Hiroki Kurosawa, a famous karate star with a big name in Japan, although at this point past his prime. This match had a rope break rule and Kurosawa kept near the ropes and getting rope breaks. He lasted until 1:14 of the 3rd round in a totally one-sided match. Kurosawa was involved in the promotion of the match and on the show poster was pushed behind only Gracie and Takada as the big stars on the show. Kurosawa suffered a thigh injury during the first round delivering a kick and taped it up, but eventually his leg totally gave out after throwing more kicks and he was unable to continue. The first, and perhaps last International Wrestling Forum pay-per-view show was unique to say the least. It was probably the greatest collection of athletes ever put together on one American Wrestling or NHB pay-per-view event. And it was just about the poorest attended and least exciting shows ever. Before an estimated crowd of 250 fans in Sioux City, Iowa on October 11th, the latest brainchild of former EFC promoter John Peretti flopped due to poor planning, horrible production, no fans or interest, and rules eliminating striking, which made the matches for the most part basically turn into sport jiu-jitsu. The basic theme of the event was to use world-class wrestlers and match them against top-level submission experts. While the caliber of the fighters was good, the rules, largely due to trying to fit in given the current political climate, limited what they could do. And even with striking eliminated, not only did Viewers' Choice in Canada pull out of carrying the event, but about 10% of the cable systems in the US pulled out, giving the excuses that the matches didn't have enough rules or that given the rules they expected the event to be too violent. Given the letter by TCI to Semaphore Entertainment Group, using the lack of outside sanctioning as its excuse for not carrying UFC events, IWF formed a partnership with USA Wrestling to be an outside sanctioning body to recognize the event. But after the show was over, with several post-show arguments, that partnership was very much threatened because the wrestling side was very disappointed that the wrestlers came out of the show not looking very good. That may be a moot point because the show wasn't expected to do any kind of a buy rate, and thus it's questionable whether they would attempt the second show tentatively scheduled for January 31st. In addition, the cable industry, largely due to political pressures, seems as a whole to be backing away from NHB, no matter how many rules are put in place as so-called safeguards. And even though this was promoted more as wrestling than NHB, in some cases it was still being painted with the same brush. While the sport was new for the US, it was basically the same rules as Japanese sports of submission arts wrestling, SAW, and combat wrestling, neither of which have any real popularity. Of the 7 matches, 5 were basically similar. The wrestler would wind up on the top of the submission fighter, but being unable to strike, there wasn't much he could do from that position other than keep the position. The submission fighter would work for submissions from the bottom, but in most cases, without any luck, and the match would go the 5-round, 3-minute rounds, time limit. How decisions were rendered was just one of the numerous major flaws in the show. No point-scoring rules were announced to the crowd. During matches, point-scoring rules were vaguely dispensed, but as the matches went on, viewers were given no idea if points had been scored. The idea was that there would be points for takedowns or throws. However, the submission guys, to avoid the takedowns and throws, would simply grab the wrestlers and fall backwards to the ground and hold them in a guard. And for the most part, there the match would end. Dan Gable, the famed Olympic gold medalist, who did the announcing with Dave Bontempo and Peretti, was totally unfamiliar with the names and basics of submission, although to his credit, he appeared to be a quick learner as the show went on. But that was still no excuse to go in so unprepared that he didn't even know the names of the fighters, and continually would refer to Ring's Tsuyoshi Kosaka as the Japanese fighter. The production was really schlock, with just 2 camera shots. The pre-fight interviews were worse than atrocious, particularly lengthy interviews by Kosaka and Pedernarias in Japanese and Portuguese respectively, with no translations whatsoever being offered. The 2 matches that didn't go that way were really the only exciting matches on the show. Unlike most of the submission fighters, largely Brazilian jiu-jitsu experts who fought a passive style from the bottom waiting for the wrestlers to make mistakes that just didn't happen, Frank Shamrock came out aggressively looking for the leg submission on 2-time Olympic wrestler Dan Henderson and made him tap from an ankle lock in 56 seconds. The win highly elevated Shamrock's stock in NHB. In the past, many had questioned his success in Pancrase due both its different rules from NHB and also because many in that world questioned the legitimacy of Pancrase. Those who questioned his ability were given more ammunition when he lost a decision to John LeBay in his first and only NHB match to this point. However, in quickly making Henderson, coming off winning an NHB tournament in Brazil, tap out, he answered a lot of skeptics, and Semaphore Entertainment Group immediately became interested in putting him against Kevin Jackson to create UFC's first middleweight champion on the proposed December 21st UFC show from the Yokohama Arena. The other pitted former EFC and Pancrase fighter Matt Hume against Kenny Monday, the 1988 Olympic gold medalist in wrestling and generally considered very close to the top of the list of the best wrestlers of this generation. Monday went for a submission of his own, left his leg behind, and Hume took advantage with an ankle lock in just 45 seconds, scoring what on paper would have to be considered a gigantic upset. Kosaka, the other big-name pro wrestler on the show, battled Tom Erickson, the USA Super Heavyweight Freestyle Champion, for 5 rounds, with Erickson getting the decision. No announcement was made as to why Erickson, who outweighed Kosaka 283 pounds to 217, got the decision, as even though he controlled the top position throughout the match, he did nothing while on top, and Kosaka was continually working for submission and got him in 2 dangerous positions in the 5th round. Based on the scoring system, Erickson should have won the first round by momentarily passing the guard, and Kosaka should have won the 5th round with the near submissions, and the other 3 rounds, with nothing of note happening, should have been even rounds. In the most dramatic match of the show, which actually took place before the pay-per-view went on live but the final 2 rounds of which were inserted into the show on top, Carlos Newton, a Canadian Jiu-Jitsu champion, defeated former wrestling All-American Chris Barnes from Oklahoma by getting him in an armbar at 2:47 of round 5, or just 13 seconds before the end of a match that Barnes largely controlled and appeared on the verge of winning an easy decision in. In other matches, Townsend Saunders, an Olympic competitor and World Cup silver medalist in freestyle wrestling, was awarded a 3-2 decision on points over Andre Pedernarias, a famed Brazilian jiu-jitsu expert, in a boring match. Wrestler Mike Van Arsdale was awarded a 3-0 decision over Brazilian jiu-jitsu competitor Renato Verasimo, a late replacement for Igor Zinoviev, who had to cancel due to herniated discs in his back. The other results saw a surprise in that it went the time limit, but the Brazilian captured a 2-1 decision, with João Roque beating 1996 Olympic silver medalist Dennis Hall in a match that surprisingly saw Roque reverse Hall and get his back. Japanese television rundown. September 26th rings. 1. Yuri Korchikin beat Malcolm Ney in 4:33 with an ankle lock. Match was a shoot, but nothing special. 2. Peter Williams beat Joop Kasteel in 8:32 when Kasteel simply quit out of exhaustion. Kasteel, who was the larger of the 2, juiced-up-looking fighter from the Netherlands who seemed to be stronger on their feet, simply ran out of gas and collapsed in the middle of the ring. This was pretty clearly a shoot. 3. Wataru Sakata beat Valentine Overeem of the Netherlands in 2:16 with an ankle lock. It was a short match, also a shoot, but the finish was great. 4. Frank Shamrock beat Tsuyoshi Kosaka by a 1-0 score after they had gone the 30 minutes time limit. This was probably the most exciting and grueling true shoot match since the Pancrase Boss Rutan vs Masakatsu Funaki match last year. Mark Coleman vs Maurice Smith was more dramatic because of the setting and the upset, but these were two evenly matched fighters, neither of whom blew up, who both combined good striking and great grappling skills. The only point scored was Shamrock's at 11 minutes with a front guillotine where Kosaka got a rope break. Both had several near submissions during the match. 5. Akira Maeda beat Andrei Kopylov in 8:32 with a choke. After following 4 shoot matches, the intensity level was so different for a worked match it was obvious the difference. Still, it was a decent match. 6. Kiyoshi Tamura beat Folk Han in 12:48 with the armbar submission. Of course this was a worked match. Ring style seems to be to put the shoot matches, because of their unpredictability and because they usually aren't entertaining. Shamrock vs Kosaka was the exception, not the rule. On early and put great workers like Han or Tamura on last so the main event can be counted on to be good. When you put them against each other, you've pretty much got it guaranteed, and this was the same type of excellent match as their previous 2 encounters. It may have actually been more dramatic because of the match, and the realistic-looking knockdown kicks by Tamura, and the fact that unlike their previous bouts, he went over, by submission, in the end to a guy who had beaten him in January in the Battle Dimension tournament final. Mexico. The Headhunters and Steel have been suspended from wrestling in the Distrito Federal, which is going to force Promo Azteca to do all its television tapings when those 3 are around to be outside the DF, Mexico City metropolitan area. The Box y Lucha Commission issued the suspension after Paco Alonso of EMLL accused them of no showing his major card without any warning and showing up the same night on the Azteca show. The Azteca group claims that Alonso was called at 2 p.m. that day and told that they weren't going to appear due to Victor Quiñones, their business manager, and Alonso having the falling out when Alonso canceled Dr. Wagner Jr.'s bookings with WWF because he wanted to work with WCW. The funny thing now is that WCW has decided against using any new Mexican wrestlers, so Wagner Jr. never did even make it to WCW, and now is scheduled to debut probably under another name, with WWF at the October 20th tapings in Oklahoma City. Giving credence to the Azteca story, aside from it being consistent with what we've known all along, is that Alonso was frantically the afternoon trying to contact big-name independent wrestlers to work the show, which he wouldn't have done unless he had knowledge that big names were canceling out of the show. The climate is expected to change because a new commission comes in on December 5th, because the PRI party, which has controlled Mexican elections forever, lost the last election, and the PRD party is coming in, and mission posts are generally awarded in exchange for political favors, and the new group is thought to be more favorable to Azteca. Pablo Marks starts with Azteca in November. The CMLL World Heavyweight Title Tournament should be decided on October 14th at Arena Coliseo. Rayo de Jalisco Jr., CN Cars and Universo 2000 all won mini-tournaments to advance to the finals, and one more slot was to be filled this past week. Believe it or not, there has been discussion of Azteca and EMLL working together in Mexico against their common enemy, Antonio Pena. Pena is now debuting his own wrestler under the name of Zorro, the same name as the Azteca wrestler. Nevertheless, Black Warrior made a surprise return to EMLL on October 10th. He had jumped to Azteca because of the lure of a WCW contract. He became an innocent victim in the power play between Eric Bischoff and Conan, with Bischoff canceling the Disney appearances of numerous Mexican wrestlers at the last minute that were originally booked: Venom, Mosco de la Merced, Super Crazy, Super Astro, El Texano, Black Warrior and Mr. Aguila, and saying he didn't want to add any new wrestlers from Mexico. TV tapings for the week were October 10th in Naucalpan for Azteca, with Pierre Roth Jr. defending the WWO heavyweight title against Tinieblas Jr., Mascara Sagrada and Tarzan Boy and Zorro versus Jerry Estrada and Villano 3 and Pirata Morgan and Venom and Pantera and Salcero and Torero versus Mosco de la Merced and Pantera del Ring, Ultimo Guerrero and Ultimo Rebelde. The show was watered down when it came to big names since most of them were at the WCW tapings in Orlando. They looked to be building toward a Halloween night spectacular, with Salcero and Torero both putting up their hair against the masks of Ultimo Guerrero and Ultimo Rebelde. October 10th at Arena Mexico at Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Lizmark and Mr. Niebla versus CN Caras and Scorpio Jr. and Apollo Dantes and Brazo de Plata and Felino and Shocker versus Emilio Charles Jr. and Violencia and Rey Bucanero. The AAA taping was October 10th in Chilpancingo, with Pero Aguayo and Latin Lover and Frisbee versus Cibernetico and Fuerza Guerrera and The Killer and La Parca Jr. and Trid, and Luxor and Discovery versus Psicosis, Leon Negro and Picudo and My Flowers and Payaso Negro. Lots of rumors of Blue Panther and Fuerza Guerrero leaving AAA for EMLL. To tell you how bad things are, there are guys working mid-card on the Friday night Arena Mexico shows when they draw poorly who are getting $11 payoffs, which I guess makes Jerry Jarrett look like Santa Claus. All Japan. The major show of the week was October 11th in Fukuoka before 5,100 fans with Mitsuharu Misawa retaining the Triple Crown pinning Steve Williams in 24-21 with a Tiger Driver. The match aired the next night on television. After Misawa retained the title, it was announced that the October 21st match with Misawa vs. Kenta Kobashi at Budokan Hall would be a title defense. In a non-title match, tag champs Kobashi and Johnny Ace beat Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue in 24-46 when Ace pinned Taue using the Cobra suplex, and the other top bout saw Hayabusa and Manukiya Mossman over Kentaro Shiga and Jun Akiyama in 1812 when Hayabusa pinned Shiga after a Firebird 450 splash. They ran October 10th in Hiroshima before 3,400 with a six-man on top with Kawada and Taue and Yoshinari Ogawa beating Misawa and Jun Akiyama, and Satoru Asako and a PWF Junior title match with Manukiya Mossman retaining the title pinning Rex King in 1840. September 28th TV show did a 2.4 rating. New Japan. A few more matches have been announced for the November 2nd Fukuoka Dome show. Tatsumi Fujinami and Genichiro Tenryu vs. Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono. Naoya Ogawa vs. Irving Frankel, billed as a kickboxing protege of Gerard Gordeau from Holland, and Don Frye vs. Kazuo Yamazaki. Shinya Hashimoto's opponent is expected to be announced this week. They are still pushing Shinjiro Otani's J-Crown title defense against Wild Pegasus, and Pegasus is definitely booked for the show. The new tour, billed as the NWO Typhoon Tour, pushed as an NWO Tour as opposed to a New Japan Tour, opened October 10th in Koriyama before a sellout 3,000 fans. The gimmick for this tour is that Muto works without the face paint for the first time as a heel NWO member, and that the NWO gets the main event on every show. The only foreigners on the tour are Michael Wallstreet, NWO Sting, Negro Casas and Prince Aokiya. The plan now for the January 4th Tokyo Dome show, as far as Riki Choshu's final match is concerned, is that Choshu will wrestle 5 matches on the show, most likely being Kazuyuki Fujita, Yuji Nagata, Osamu Nishimura, Tatsuhiro Takaiwa, and Koji Kanemoto. They ran an angle on the October 12th Korakuen Hall show. Main event was a 10-man tag with Hiro Saito and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and NWO Sting and Chono and Muto vs. Heisei Ishgun's team of Akitoshi Saito and Michiyoshi Ohara and Akira Nagami and Kengo Kimura and Tatsutoshi Goto. At 15 minutes mark, with Nagami having Tenzan pin, Goto turned on his teammates and gave Nagami his back suplex finisher. Ohara then joined with Goto and began putting the boots to Nagami, and the two walked out and left for the dressing room. There had been teases for a while that Goto and Ohara would join the NWO. After the match, Chono said that they couldn't join the NWO until they proved themselves. Shiro Koshinaka, who is still out with a knee injury, was also attacked by the NWO, including Muto giving him the Dragon Screw leg whip. September 27th TV show did a 2.0 rating. Other Japan notes. Michinoku Pro Wrestling ran its biggest show of the year on October 10th at Sumo Hall in Tokyo before 6,000 fans with some help from the WWF. Appearing on the show booked through WWF were Undertaker, who was managed on this show by Bruce Pritchard, and Sonny, along with Chris Condito from ECW and Taka Michinoku and Victor Quinones as well. Show opened with Yone Jinjin, managed by Miss Mongol from FMW, beating Magic Man in 153. Magic Man did his juggling and magic act before the show, which was really good, but his wrestling was poor. Tiger Mask and Gran Hamada beat Chris Condito and the Convict, Superboy from Los Angeles, in a match described as so-so because of the style conflict. Sonny was at ringside taking photos of this match. Satoru Sayama made El Satanico submit in 6:38 with a cross arm breaker. The story behind this match is that this was the first meeting between the two since March 28, 1980, when Satanico beat Sayama to win the NWA middleweight title in Mexico City. Undertaker pinned Jinsei Shinzaki, who for this match used his old WWF ring name of Hakushi in 1208 with the tombstone, and then put him in a coffin after the match. Fans enjoyed the basic Undertaker gimmick show with the lights and everything. Then came the basic Michinoku-style six-man with Super Delphin and Naohiro Hoshikawa and Masato Yakashiji beating Dick Togo and Men's Teo, and Shoichi Funaki in 1844 when Delphin used the Delphin clutch on Togo. Main event was a street fight with Sunny serving as the ring announcer with Great Sasuke vs Michinoku. She introduced Michinoku as being from the WWF and she sat at ringside in his corner but never interfered. The match was a high-flying spectacular ending in 28-21 when Sasuke got the pin with a German suplex. After the match, Sasuke vowed to keep the promotion alive. The show aired over the weekend on the Samurai Channel. The Iki Kajiwara Memorial Show drew a poor crowd of 4,000 to Sumo Hall on October 12. The newspapers all listed a Dan Severn vs Yasunori Matsumoto match as being on the card. Severn was never even contacted about it until after he had agreed to do the show the night before. Several of the reporters even went to Severn after the chemo match saying they were going to see him tomorrow. Obviously Severn didn't appear on the show. The main event wound up being Yoshiaki Fujiwara vs Super Tiger, Sayama, stemming from their 1984 to 1985 series of matches in the first UWF promotion. Antonio Inoki was the referee and at one point he stopped the match ruling it a double DQ because both were violating the rules, then restarted the match, and again had to stop the match a second time and ruled it a no contest. The other interesting match saw the Battle of the Tiger Masks. The original Sayama and the fourth Tiger Mask, the current Michinoku pro wrestler, beat the second Tiger Mask. The actual second Tiger Mask was Mitsuharu Misawa, but with All Japan running a card on the same day, they instead sent prelim wrestler Yoshinobu Kanemaru to work under the Tiger Mask. And the third Tiger Mask, Koji Kanemoto, when Sayama used the cross-arm breaker on Kanemaru in 1208. Great Sasuke was the referee of the match, so you had four wrestlers all wearing identical Tiger masks, and a masked referee as well. Iki Kajiwara, who died many years ago, was the creator of the original Tiger Mask cartoon television show in the late 70s in Japan, which spawned all the Tiger Mask wrestlers of the 80s and 90s. We don't have a lot of details, but on the FMW show on October 14th in Sapporo, Atsushi Onita and Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Haido won the World Six-Man Street Fight titles from Hayabusa and Koji Nakagawa and Masato Tanaka. All Japan Women's WrestleMarinePiad 97 takes place October 18th at Yokohama Bunka Gym with Yumiko Hata defending the WWWA title against Kaoru Ito, which is the title defense Ito gets for winning the Grand Prix tournament, plus Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda, who have already left the promotion, will return to defend their WWWA tag titles against Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Maekawa and Manami Toyota and Emi Motokawa vs Kyoko Ichiki and Takako Inoue. The Plum Marco Memorial Show on October 30th at Tokyo's Oto Ward Gymnasium will include an 8-woman JWP tag match with Devil Masami and Boyoshoy Kid and Tomoko Miyaguchi and Sari Azumi vs Hikari Fukuoka and Tomoko Kuzumi and Kanako Matoya and Rieko Amano. Kyoko Inoue, Free, vs Esther Moreno, JD, Aya Koyama vs Nana Fujimura, Big Japan, Chiru vs Okada, SBWF, Yuko Kasugi and Miyuki Sagabi vs Sumiko Sakai and Megumi Yabushita, JD, Emi Motokawa vs Sachi Nishibori, IWA, and an LLPW Battle Royal. Wataru Sakata of Rings and Misao Orihara will work the November 5th Battle Arts show at Korakuen Hall with Orihara challenging Minoru Tanaka for the UWA middleweight title. Akira Hokuto officially vacated the WCW women's title due to her injuries. Takashi Ishikawa's new Tokyo Pro Wrestling promotion debuted on October 10th in Tokyo before 300 fans. Bad news: Alan and Jerry Morrow are involved in booking foreigners from the Calgary area. The top two matches saw Shunmei Matsuzaki win the CCW World title beating Shigeo Okamura, and Ishikawa and Kishin Kawabata won the CCW World Tag Team titles beating Ken Johnson and Bad News Allen. Pancrase on October 29th at Korakuen Hall has Yuki Kondo vs Leon Dyke, Kyuma Kunyoku vs Guy Mesger, Asami Shibuya vs John LeBay, Keiichiro Yamamiya vs Trey Telligman, Yoshiki Takahashi vs Kim Jong-wan and prelims. Jason Godse is out of action with a knee injury. Igor Zinoviev, the EFC middleweight champion, has signed to debut with Pancrase in December. Here and there. Jesus Torres, a longtime independent promoter and father of 3 wrestling sons in Los Angeles, passed away on October 10th at the age of 58 from liver cancer. Torres headed El Moro Promotions, which had run Saturday night shows in Los Angeles at the All Nations Center for many years. He was one of a handful of wrestlers who ran local lucha libre shows from the early 70s. He was diagnosed with liver cancer 2 weeks ago and given the prognosis of having 3 months to live. On October 5th, they held a show where Torres would say goodbye to the local wrestlers and fans before going back home to Guadalajara to spend the final months of his life with his parents and family. However, just 3 days after arriving in Guadalajara, he passed away. His 3 sons have wrestled for many years, mainly on Southern California independent shows as Superboy, Capitan Oro, and Principe Indu. Superboy has also worked Japan regularly for Michinoku Pro Wrestling, both under the name Superboy and also as the Convict. The next day, they held a memorial show at the All Nation Center as a show of support of both the local wrestlers and the local fans. As it turned out, 40 local wrestlers showed up to work for no pay, forcing every match on the show to become an 8-man tag. There was supposed to be a court date on the battle for USWA control this past week, but it wound up being postponed, so at this point the promotion is still in limbo with no cards nor new television. Reports we have are that WMC TV would be amenable to putting a wrestling show back on the air, either from another promotion, or even from USWA once this whole deal is settled. Dutch Mantle is now booking Puerto Rico, and is taking some of the USWA wrestlers to work with him there. The Cauliflower Alley Club held its annual Northeastern Banquet on October 11th in Newark, New Jersey with more than 300 attendees including numerous area wrestlers. Georgianne Macropolis became the first wrestling fan ever honored by the club. Fred Blassie surprisingly ranted and raved against WCW, bringing up Jim Cornette's interview about the NWO and that WCW has a wrestling school, and that Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall should go to the school so they can all learn to wrestle. Uthez 81 recently underwent an eye operation to remove cataracts. A correction on the Jack Adkisson obit of a few weeks back. The famous NWA title match with Gene Kiniski listed as being at Texas Stadium was actually held at Turnpike Stadium, which was later known as Arlington Stadium. USWF has a show on October 18th in Amarillo, but the plan is after this show to not run again for several months in Amarillo. Promoter Steve Nelson fears he's burning out the market with so many shows. Rick Baseman, whose main claim to fame in pro wrestling was recruiting Jim Hellwig and Steve Borden into the business back in 1985, has been since April running Extreme University, a shoot-fighting school which includes regular seminars over the next few months with people like Carlson Gracie, Mark Coleman, Mark Kerr, and Maurice Smith. In 1998 they are going to expand to teaching boxing with Ken Norton and Gennaro Hernandez, and pro wrestling with Rey Mysterio. The next all-pro wrestling show in Hayward, on October 18th, will be netcast live on America Online starting at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. NWA on October 25th in Lake Hiawatha, New Jersey at the East Coast Pro Wrestling School has George Steele vs. King Kong Bundy, Pitbull No. 2 vs. Salvatore Sincere, Debbie Combs vs. Sensational Sherry in a dog collar match, plus appearing live will be Jim Cornette and Doak Hendricks. On the same day, all of the above names will be at a wrestling convention in Totowa, New Jersey at the Holiday Inn. For more info you can call 201-462-2434. Century Wrestling Alliance on October 18th in Somerville, Massachusetts at Good Times Emporium at 1 p.m. and in Lawrence, Massachusetts at South Lawrence East School at 7:30 p.m. with Tony Atlas and Vic Steamboat as headliners. Manny Fernandez is now working as the wrestling coach at Concord High School in Concord, NC. Since there are people who miss the names that are used at incredibly strange wrestling shows, on the next show on October 18th will include La Femme Nikita Koloff, a Russian doing a gay act, the Dianetic Death Squad and Los Paparazzis. NHB. Add no elbowing in the back to the no headbutt rule instituted for the October 17th UFC show. Even with the rule changes being made weekly, there is no evidence of movement from the cable industry. Enson Inoue, who recently captured the World Heavyweight Championship in Shudo beating Joe Estes via knockout in 106 on October 12th at Korakuen Hall, will face Frank Shamrock on the Japanese Valley Tudo Open show on November 29th. Also on that show will be Steve Nelson vs. Akira Gono. Dieselberto, who also did pro wrestling many years back for Championship Wrestling from Florida as Haiti Kid Berto, was in a serious auto accident on October 4th near St. Petersburg, Florida, suffering multiple fractures and a punctured lung. ECW mainly a quiet week with house show on October 10th in Rostraver, Pennsylvania drawing 1,000 and October 11th in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania drawing about 400. Both Tommy Dreamer and Sandman were still out of action. They did an angle where Doug Furnace and Phil LaFon attacked Dreamer in Rostraver and it wound up with the so-called WWF guys, Furnace, LaFon, Al Snow, Sabu and Rob Van Dam, all beating on the home team Dreamer and Taz. Since both shows were near Pittsburgh, where Shane Douglas is from, Douglas is the area promoter, They were built around Douglas as the top face as he and Bam Bam Bigelow beat Sabu and Van Dam the first night, and the second night he beat Sabu in a title match which saw liberal interference from both Van Dam and Bigelow. Chris Condito missed the weekend due to working Michinoku Pro Wrestling. The general reaction with all the new undercard guys having been brought in is that the wrestling underneath is better than it has been, but none of the wrestling is great in that there are more solid workers than before but not the spectacular caliber workers as were in the promotion a few years ago. ECW will have a new ticket information number at 215-755-4177. The old number was Todd Gordon's jewelry store, so for the past few weeks the messages were slow in being processed. Gordon and Paul Heyman talk regularly, but Heyman said that there are no plans at all for Gordon to return. Gordon had apparently told friends Heyman had asked him to come back as a heel manager, but he felt it was too soon. Some talk of the Headhunters returning. WCW. Jeff Jarrett's contract expired on October 7th, and he's through with the promotion. There's a lot of speculation he's WWF bound, particularly with Jesse James changing his ring name back to the Roadie and turning heel, and when he made the turn, they acknowledged his former partnership with Jarrett. Jerry Jarrett had been handling the negotiations with Eric Bischoff and had been, at least in Bischoff's opinion, and I'd concur on this, negotiating in the media. Bischoff then went public and told the same people that he was pulling his $300,000 offer off the table because of that. Bischoff, who clearly sees himself in a powerful, perhaps omnipotent position because of just how far the company has turned around, is playing lots of hardball in negotiations, which naturally leads to ruffled feathers. Terry Taylor asked for a raise but was turned down. Bischoff put his foot down in regard to Conan, canceling the bookings at the Universal Studio tapings this past week of all the Mexican wrestlers scheduled to come in from Promo Azteca that weren't already under contract, and said he won't bring in any new Mexican wrestlers until 1998. In addition, they are going to take the mask off Rey Mysterio Jr. in a mask versus title match against Eddie Guerrero at Halloween Havoc. The Mexicans had been strongly against Mysterio Jr. losing his mask. There had been office sentiment that the mask was keeping him from fully getting over in the US, and because he's got a good look, it would help him, although many feel he looks so young without the mask on that he'll look like a teenager, and nobody will take him seriously. Either way, it's probably 18 months to 2 years too early to remove his mask, because it could be built into something incredible if it's done correctly over time, but nobody has any care or patience unless it's the top of the card. In regard to the Jarrett Angle position, on the October 13th Nitro, they simply announced his contract had expired and he'd left, and that Deborah McMichael would get a new protege, who wasn't announced but is at this point planned to be Alex Wright, to face Steve McMichael at the Havoc pay-per-view. They also added Yuji Nagata vs. Ultimo Dragon to the show, which should be a great match. WCW attempted to get Shinjiro Otani for the show, but since New Japan is in the middle of the tour, they couldn't get him. Nitro on October 13th from Tampa drew 12,000 fans, 9,139 paying $170,759, $55,000 in merchandise. In the only dark match, Norman Smiley pinned La Parka. They opened with a Hogan and Bischoff and Savage interview, with Savage having his neck in a brace. Eddie Guerrero retained the Cruiserweight title, pinning Psicosis with a frog splash in 3:43. Psicosis did a senton from the top rope to the floor. Good short match. They aired the second Mexican wrestling segment, dealing with the mask. Very professionally done and accurate. Roddy Piper did an interview and said he had taken the physical belt from Hulk Hogan, who earlier in the show had demanded it back. Steve McMichael pinned Steven Regal in 3:35 with a tombstone piledriver in an awful match. Deborah and Steve had a confrontation where Deborah said she had a new opponent for Steve in the stipulation match. Yuji Nagata used the Nagata lock, a variation of a figure four, to beat Chris Jericho in 4:06 after interference from Sonny Ono. Good match. Bill Goldberg pinned Scotty Riggs after a suplex in 2:34. Goldberg showed a ton of potential. At various times during the show they had Raven at ringside with his group, which now includes Perry Saturn. The unknown guy is named Scott Vick, who will wrestle as Sick Scott Vick from the Power Plant, plus Stevie Richards, perhaps Lou Spicolli, and Billy Kidman, who will simply be known as Kidman. Steiners won the WCW tag titles, beating Six and Scott Hall in 5:56 of a good match when they did simultaneous pins. Rick on Hall after a bulldog off the top and Scott and Six. The ref was out, so Larry Zbyszko counted the fall. Later in the show, Roddy Piper announced the decision would stick. Dean Malenko beat Mysterio Jr. in 4:51 with a cloverleaf after Guerrero pulled off Mysterio Jr.'s mask and he submitted rather than have his face exposed. Real good match, but the heat level was down. Piper did another interview. Bischoff and Savage came out and it wound up with Hogan coming out as well, and the entire NWO attacked Piper and they destroyed him. Scott Norton pinned Ray Traylor in 440 after hitting him with a spray paint can in a bad match. Disco Inferno kept the TV title, pinning Alex Wright in 546 by reversing a rolling reverse cradle and holding the trunks. Wright used the move when Disco was distracted by Jacqueline. It was announced that Disco vs. Jacqueline would be a non-title match by orders of the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Actually, WCW nearly had the match pulled by the commission, but came to a compromise of which I'm not totally aware of, but I believe there really won't be a match. There is a general feeling that nobody wants the match because it serves no purpose and really makes no sense, but Bischoff is forcing it because he has to get Disco to do the job to Jacqueline, since it was the terms of letting him back in the company. Final saw Diamond Dallas Page beat Curt Hennig in a U.S. title match in 7:25. At the same time, Page pinned Hennig with a schoolboy. Flair interfered. Ref Randy Anderson DQ'd Page for Flair's interference. However, he had counted 3 before calling for the DQ, so Roddy Piper reversed the decision. After the match, the NWO destroyed Piper and Page until a million stings. A bunch of jobbers dressed up. All did run-ins and all had their wigs pulled off and were destroyed. Finally, one of them turned out to be the real Sting and he cleaned house. The finish was too circus-like. No ratings at press time due to Columbus Day holiday holding everything up. Among the people backstage at Nitro included Dan Spivey, who looks 100 years older than he did as Waylon Mercy, Brian Blair, Jimmy Richland, Jimmy Del Rey, whose career may be over due to another knee surgery, Shiva AFI, Lanny Poffo, Steve Kieran, Ed Leslie, and baseball star Wade Boggs. WCW is now talking about running more than 250 house shows next year. The idea is, since there are so many wrestlers under contract, to run split crews every weekend with 2 shows per night. They have 20 dates booked in January. The Nitros will be January 5th in Atlanta at the new Georgia Dome, will be given the basketball setup of 20,000 seats, January 12th in Jacksonville, January 19th in New Orleans at the Superdome, and January 26th in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The new Thursday show will debut January 8th in Daytona Beach, January 15th in Lakeland, Florida, January 22nd in Huntsville, Alabama, and January 29th in Evansville, Indiana. There will also be a pay-per-view on January 24th in Dayton and a house show on January 31st at the Fleet Center in Boston. Meng will face Bill Goldberg at the World War III pay-per-view show. This is supposed to be a big deal because Goldberg does a shoot-fighting gimmick and because Meng is supposed to be the toughest man in the world. Of course, since the fans see Meng as a mid-card guy who has been around forever and nobody cares a lick about him, and because the announcers either are afraid to talk about, not allowed to talk about, or simply don't know anything about shoot fighting to talk about it, Goldberg has this unspoken gimmick which means nobody at home understands the significance of either guy, let alone the match. Don Frye said that he was given an offer by WCW, but wants to finish his New Japan commitments first, since they gave him his first break and they asked him not to start with WCW as of yet. New Japan has him positioned as a shooter, and if he starts bouncing off the ropes and doing jobs like Ken Shamrock, his value in Japan will drop. Announcers were specifically told not to mention Brian Pillman's death on television, and that the only mention would be the graphic on Nitro. Supposedly it was because of the lawsuit filed by WWF against WCW. Lanny Poffo was supposed to get a tryout this week. At a local indie show, promoter Roland Alexander in the ring claimed that when WCW was in San Francisco, he met Hall at a local hotel. He claimed Hall got upset when a local valet for the promotion turned down his advances and pretended to accidentally spill a drink all over Alexander. He then ripped on Hall, saying there are so many others who would gladly sign a WCW contract that would represent pro wrestling so much better. Kevin Nash is now off crutches, but it'll be 6 to 8 weeks before he's back in the ring, although it's likely he'll make an appearance at Havoc. Ric Flair isn't 100% to wrestle at Havoc, although he'll do the match. His face from the surgery is still very tender and he has to be really careful for several more weeks. WWF. Raw on October 7th in Topeka, Kansas drew 4,199, paying $56,445. The show opened with a Hart Foundation interview, although they did very little talking. Michaels and Triple H were on the wall doing most of the talking, and giving themselves the new moniker of Degeneration X. After that was over, the Nation of Domination came out. Owen Hart beat Kama via DQ in 5:15. Michaels, Triple H, and Chyna were at ringside eating bananas. Virtually everything Michaels and Triple H are doing, right down to taking the headphones from the commentators, is a copy of WCW. Well, not to say WCW hasn't done its share of copying, There was a new attitude of ripping on Hogan, with McMahon ripping on the movie No Holds Barred and how much money he lost on the movie, saying Hogan promised if the money lost money that he'd pay McMahon back out of his wrestling salary, and then McMahon saying that he's still waiting for that check. Later the LOD ripped on Hogan and Savage, saying they weren't like those two guys resting on their reputations from the past who have nothing left. The show was built around LOD retiring if they didn't win the tag titles from the Godwins, with interviews and highlights of LOD throughout the show. Max Mini and Nova beat Mosaic and Tarantula in 2:21 when Max pinned Mosaic. Very short, but a lot better than the pay-per-view match, with a couple of cool dives at the finish. Kane destroyed Flash Funk and left. Michaels came out and covered Funk, with Helmsley counting the pin and Rude doing the ring introductions and announcements. 8-Ball and Skull beat Recon and Sniper via DQ in 3:48 with Interrogator, who they are trying to push as a monster for Undertaker, going crazy. Austin and McMahon did their deal, with Austin being reinstated and signing an IC title match. In real life, Austin's meeting with Dr. Joseph Torg in Philadelphia this past week was said to have been sobering. Torg said that if Austin suffered another bump like the one he got from Owen Hart, there was a good chance of temporarily paralysis. Brian Christopher beat Yoshihiro Tajiri using the tights in 5:22 of a real good match. Tajiri looked great. Goldust beat Savio Vega in 4:17 after hitting him with Marlena's purse. Good match. LOD won the belts from Godwins in 11:10 when Hawk pinned Phineas after a clothesline off the ropes. Match itself wasn't good, but the finish was well booked. Animal was injured and carried out, leaving Hawk by himself. Animal, as he was being carried out, recovered and sprinted back to the ring to save Hawk. After the match, the Godwins attacked and destroyed Uncle Cletus, with the cameras doing a close-up on his badly bloodied nose, so they are going into the graphic violence. I'd expect that both Cletus and Honky Tonk Man, who Rockabilly turned on and clocked with the guitar when Rockabilly joined forces with Rhodey as a tag team, are history. Among the shotgun matches taped in Topeka were Bret over Triple H, Flash Funk over Rockabilly, Dude Love over Castillo Jackal, Don Callis, and Interrogator over Skull and 8-Ball, and in the dark matches, LOD over Owen and Bulldog and Undertaker over Bret via DQ. Bulldog missed the weekend house shows due to an injury suffered while lifting weights. Farouk was out of action this weekend with a knee injury. Vader was out of action with a hyperextended elbow suffered in the Shamrock match in Japan. Shamrock returned and did a 20 minutes 3.5 stars match with Bret Hart in Anaheim on October 11th, and also worked with Bret and Triple H in triangle matches in San Jose and San Diego the next two nights. In Anaheim, they had a couple of outside interference finish teases before Bret scored a clean pin by reversing a small package. In San Jose, in the triangle match, Michaels, who was advertised as the referee but instead just was in the corner wreaking havoc, superkicked Shamrock. Actually, he missed him badly, and Bret ran in and scored the pin to keep the title. Michaels wrestled in Anaheim, teaming with Helmsley in a title match, losing via DQ to LOD. It was acknowledged all weekend that LOD had won the belts and their matches on the shows would be title matches. Anaheim drew 9,266 and $159,793. San Jose drew 6,155 and $117,181, and San Diego on October 12 drew 5,947 and $91,382. They announced the Royal Rumble for San Jose and sold 2,500 tickets already. Merchandise for the weeks was $199,934 or $7.79 per head. San Jose house show was pretty bad. D'Lo Brown pinned Mark Mero when interfered in a decent opener, although the result tells you something about Mero's stock right now. Mero had almost no charisma with his new look. Brackus pinned Sultan in 138 with a spinebuster. I'd never seen Brackus live, but after seeing him in shock they even put him on the road, not at all because he's green, which he is, but because everyone in the crowd thinks steroids the minute they see him, as there were chants and catcalls for the entire brief match. Headbangers beat Perez and Vega in 12:56. They worked fast-paced, but it wasn't good. Neidhart pinned Flash Funk in 6:14. As bad as you'd think. LOD beat Maivia and in 7:38 with Hawk pinning Maivia with a clothesline off the top. Fast-paced and fair. Patriot pinned Neidhart with an inside cradle in 5:59. Awful. Dude Love beat Owen Hart in 11:02 of a Falls Count Anywhere match, with Austin using the stunner on Austin for the finish. Cartoon violence, with Hart selling such brutal maneuvers as being hit with a piece of carpet and a huge bag of popcorn. Pretty bad. Bret vs. Triple H vs. Shamrock was a decent main event, but nothing more. But it was the only match on the show even close to the 2 stars range. This was considerably worse than the WCW house show in this market at the Cow Palace a few weeks back, and most people hated that show as well. Taka Michinoku is expected to sign amidst a decent amount of Japanese press fanfare sometime within the next week. WCW was still trying to get him as well. Yokozuna, who is said to be down to 500 pounds, starts back on the road in November. The preliminary plan is for him to be a heel, and he may work a program with Vader. WWF will tour Saudi Arabia in December. Justin Bradshaw was working this past week in Puerto Rico, and he and Barry Windham will be going to All Japan for the tag team tournament as the Blackjacks. Of all teams they could bring in, why would All Japan want them unless they have this idea going in that they want to have bad undercard matches? November 15th in Madison Square Garden has a four-way match for the title with Undertaker, Brett, Shawn, and Austin, plus Vader versus Triple H with George Steele in Vader's corner, Owen versus Patriot for IC belt, and LOD versus Godwins in a whipping match for the belts. November 7th in Toronto at Skydome has Undertaker and Austin and Dude Love versus Brett and Owen and Bulldog, Vader versus Farouk. LOD defend against Godwins, Ahmed Johnson versus Maivia, Patriot versus Neidhart, Shamrock versus Triple H, Bangers versus D'Lo Brown and Kama, Goldust versus Vega, and Tiger Ali Singh versus Miguel Perez. Detroit on November 8th has basically the same lineup except Shamrock versus Perez. Reports that Pillman was working shows without pay due to failing a drug test at the time of his death are incorrect. Jim Ross and Eric Bischoff have had a public war of words this past week. Bischoff claimed that the best thing for WCW is for Cornette and Ross to remain with WWF. He also talked about Ross calling up and asking for a job. Ross on his hotline claimed he did make a few calls to Bischoff about a job a ways back, but that both had agreed to keep that confidential and off the record, and by Bischoff going public with it that he was a liar. The readers' pages. Pillman. So Vince McMahon began Raw by announcing Brian Pillman's death and having all the wrestlers put their differences aside for a moment to stand together in a moment of silence and ring the bell 10 times. That was appropriate and uncharacteristically classy. Then, completely inappropriately, he teases going live to Pillman's house to interview his grieving wife, "Don't touch that dial," for the rest of the show. So now a death was being used to earn points in the Monday Night Ratings war. Not to mention how inappropriate McMahon was in his questions and in deciding to do the segment at all. I also think Steve Austin should have broken character and acknowledged his association with Pillman. But at least Lawler didn't imply that Pillman's heart attack was brought on by having wild sex with Marlena in the hotel room. Incidents like that show make it harder and harder to stay a wrestling fan. Paul Armentano. Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm still trying to get over the shock of hearing about Brian Pillman's death. Once again, another wrestler in his prime is gone, and one must ask some serious questions about the pro wrestling industry. Was it the lifestyle that contributed to Pillman's demise? At this point, the cause is still to be determined, but I have a very strong fear factors like drugs, steroids, painkillers or whatever, may have played a part. I realize that Pillman lived a pretty troubled life the past few years, with his ex-girlfriend shooting herself, the drunken driving arrest, the near-fatal Humvee wreck, and all the injuries from the accident that affected his wrestling career. But he was just starting to make inroads in the WWF, which makes the sudden death even more tragic. His life was snuffed out before he had a chance to complete his comeback, which is a shame. I have mixed feelings about the way Vince McMahon handled the situation. He could have canceled or postponed the pay-per-view show, which everyone would have understood considering the circumstances. But he didn't. After all, the WWF set a new attendance record in St. Louis, and since this was a pay-per-view, the financial bath he would have taken had he canceled the pay-per-view show would have been huge, and the damage could have been irreparable. The 10-count ceremony the next night with the faces and heels standing together in unison was a class act. But it should have stopped there. The Melanie Pillman interview was unnecessary, and at times downright cruel. She may have consented to do the interview, but why am I inclined to believe that there wasn't at least some pressure from McMahon for her to go on television the night after her husband had died? If McMahon even thought for a second about using the death as a ploy to pump up the ratings, he's a very sick individual who deserves all the misfortune and troubles the wrestling war has laid out on him. Why was it necessary to show live footage of the Pillman house every 10 minutes? Was it necessary for the cameras to do a close-up on Melanie's grieving face? It was bad enough that McMahon was asking her stupid questions like, "How will you and your 5 children be able to go on?" It was as if McMahon's sole purpose was to make her cry on national television. It would have been better if she was allowed to grieve quietly with her family, and then the next week, after the funeral, come on Raw and give a taped prepared statement with no annoying questions being shoved her way, so that she could express her true feelings and thank everyone for their support and condolences. I hope that Brian Pillman has finally found the peace and quiet that he didn't have in his short turbulent life. Whether you liked him or didn't like him, he will be missed by all of us. Ramon Lors. Flushing, New York. The wrestling world has always been one to take advantage of some of the most inappropriate situations and turn them into angles. With the recent death of Jack Atkinson, we are immediately reminded of many examples of death being capitalized on numerous times. The sudden and tragic death of Brian Pillman, one of the sport's biggest stars and a man who will be remembered highly for his work in the rings in Calgary, WCW, ECW, and WWF, is a huge loss not only to the WWF, but also to us, the fans, who enjoy the high-flying excitement he once provided, and more recently, the explosive personality that kept everyone second-guessing themselves time and time again. Given the short amount of time between Pillman's death and back-to-back live television productions put on by the WWF, I'd like to, for the most part, praise the efforts of Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation for their handling of the situation. The interview with Melanie Pillman on Raw is sure to come under fire from many fans who will see it as opportunistic for ratings, and maybe even McMahon trying to turn himself babyface and save his butt in another possibly drug-induced death of a pro wrestler. We all remember the fire the industry came under after the Eddie Gilbert death, along with the deaths of John Studd and Kerry Von Erich. As a journalism student at the University of Texas, media ethics is something I study quite closely, and after analyzing the interview several times, there are definitely several ethical questions that can be raised, but I hope many reserve judgment on the situation before clearly examining things through. Yes, the interview in theory should have been good for ratings, but I think giving Melanie Pillman an opportunity to speak on the subject was a very positive thing. How many times have we complained in the past at the insensitivity of the big two promotions in not mentioning a wrestler's death when controversy was involved? Most of the interview was appropriate, with McMahon trying to paint the picture of Pillman the person, a caring and loving father, and not the character of Brian Pillman, last seen on television having an alleged affair with Marlena. He got to the heart of the issue, the painkillers. He made no attempt to cover up this troubling aspect of the industry and offered Melanie the opportunity to give her views, where she encouraged other wrestlers and their families to heed this wake-up call to the industry. The only problem I had with the piece was the extreme close-ups of an obviously distraught Melanie, the questions posed by McMahon of how she expected to get by and support her family. That question was extremely unethical given the time frame and the forum of the interview. If McMahon was so concerned, why didn't he say that the WWF would do all they could to help out the Pillman family? But I don't want to attack Vince. The 10-bell salute with the wrestlers breaking kayfabe was necessary, and a fine display. The cancellation of the Goldust/Marlena wedding and their appearances all on the show was necessary. Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler's comments were both appropriate and appreciated. The video tribute, while short in length, was very nice, and I'd hope WCW does the same, considering he worked for them for 7 years. Do not attack McMahon for his handling of this situation. Wrestling fans can at times be the most ruthless and uncaring people I've ever bared witness to. The WWF paid homage to a falling comrade about as best as they could on such short notice due to the immediacy of the death, and they should be thanked by not sending out Shawn Michaels and Hunter Hearst Helmsley to do a parody of their fitting tribute. Also, please keep Brian Hildebrand in your prayers. For those of us who know him from Smoky Mountain Fan Weeks in the past, he is a class person who deserves all the help we can offer him in mind, body, and spirit. Charles Butera. Austin, Texas. I first met Brian in Edmonton more than 10 years ago. I talked to him from time to time. He was always very open and polite and not the type who tried to put himself over all the time. He used to ask what I thought of his work and asked for tips for improvement. He was very eager to learn. He learned how to wrestle very well and very quickly. I was so excited when Jim Ross gave him his first break. He could have been another Shawn Michaels. When he started out in Calgary, you could tell he had something special. Out of Owen Hart, Chris Benoit, and the rest of the wrestlers who came from that Calgary era, Pillman had more can't miss than any of the rest. And for the most part, he didn't miss. He had some good runs. He had perhaps the best drop kick in the entire business and had looks, physique, and interview skills. Unfortunately, his lifestyle was wild from the start. In Calgary, hanging around in the fast lane with Ric Flair. He could and should have been on the top of the mountain right now. Great talent, great gifts, but a few stupid choices and bad breaks. There have been others where the same thing has happened. There have been many who haven't learned from the mistakes of others. Trent Walters. St. Albert, Alberta. Fritz Von Erich. Even though I get a few of those free online so-called wrestling newsletters every day telling me the so-called latest wrestling news, I can't tell you how much I value the Observer. I get a lot of news, Most of it is just plain wrong, from the internet, but you always seem to have a lot of news they just don't have. More important, I can rely on the observer to put the news into context. I truly believe that the future in the news business belongs not to those who merely provide the news but to those who put it into context, and you do that extremely well. I also believe the future of internet wrestling newsletters is not going to belong to the 13-year-old idiots who are, for the most part, publishing them now, often simply stealing from you and your hotline or printing the most outlandish and idiotic stuff one can imagine. These newsletters are also hurt by their incessant internecine feuding as well as the belief that they are actually important and that people depend on them for the news. I was reminded of the value of the Observer along with the lack of value of internet newsletters when I read the Fritz von Erich obituary, even though I thought your story was too kind to him. Talk about the personification of evil. He, in essence, murdered 3 or 4 of his own sons. I don't think you could ever have been too harsh on such a man. I realize your intent was to report on his life and death, but I thought he got off easy. Having said that, let me also say it was an incredible piece of journalism, not wrestling journalism, but journalism. It was multi-layered, capturing not only the essence of the man but of his times and his career. It is this type of journalism that will keep readers coming back to publications like yours even when we have faster access to news than ever before through the internet, even though you regularly scoop them on the news. Fair, tough, impartial, comprehensive reporting is what we have come to expect from you and what we get every week. But sometimes you pull off a piece like the Von Erich obit, on deadline, and we value the Observer even more. Name withheld by request. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228, October 20, 1997.